Hello, and welcome to another virtual author event at the Poison Pen Bookstore. I'm John Charles, and I'm delighted to have with us today as our special guest author, Allie Pleiter. Before we begin our chat, I do want to let those listening in know that we have copies of Allie's latest book, On Skein of Death, available for purchase. So if you'd like us to hold a copy at the bookstore or send one to you in the mail, feel free to give us a call or go online to the Poison Pen, and we would be happy to do that for you. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome in Allie. Hello.
Hello, it's lovely to be here. Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm always fascinated by the writer's journey. And in this case, let's talk a little bit about you. Who was Allie before you became a writer?
It's actually quite a long and winding story. Before I was a writer, I was an actor. I went to college I was a theater major at Northwestern University and moved from writing to directing and from directing to producing. From acting to directing and from directing to producing and from producing to fundraising, because I discovered I was a very good storyteller, and that's a useful skill in fundraising. And I was working as a professional fundraiser when I literally said to a friend of mine, I'm so tired of raising money. Why don't I just stay home and write romance novels for you? Because she happened to be the editor of a major New York publishing house romance line. And those words are going to go on my tombstone because I had said, how hard can it be, right? It has to be easier than what I'm doing now. Mm-hmm. And she very wisely said, fine, smarty pants, I dare you. And she dared me to write my first book. And that was my first romance novel. And that was 57 published books ago. So it was the most excellent dare to take.
And did you discover that writing a romance was just a little bit more difficult than you first imagined?
Romances are difficult. Mysteries are harder still. So yes, I have learned very much that it's not as easy as maybe some people think. There are people who think that I just sort of sit around and maybe for an hour a day sit in front of my laptop and have fun. It's a little more work than that.
Now, you didn't want to become a writer initially, but did you find that your background in theater and producing and directing helped you as a writer because you're used to creating characters? Or
very much so. The way it mostly shows up is that I have a very finely tuned ear for dialogue and speech and great one-liners, and that tends to come out in, most people say they really enjoy the dialogue of my books, and I think that's part of the theater training. The idea of creating a character of all the facets and layers to that comes in very much. And I think the other thing that I didn't expect from the business side of it is, in the theater, if you don't get picked to do something, it's not a personal, dent on you. You're not the right person for that role. And being able to sort of take on that mindset if you get a rejection or a bad review or something like that has been very useful. So they were terrific skill sets to bring in. And the other thing that I don't think I realized is that there are remarkably few extroverted writers. Yes. So for me to be very comfortable in front of an audience, to love to meet people and all that other things, those are real assets, both to me as an author, and my publisher has often said, I loved one of my romance publishers said, you have great bookside manner, and we're going to use that. So it's been an asset that I didn't know I
had. So you started your writing career, and 50 some books later, you decided you wanted to write a mystery. What prompted that?
A friend of mine was working with a publishing house that needed a knitting mystery. Mm-hmm. And she said, do you think you could do that? You were the first person I thought of. And I thought, well, it was very funny because I've written nonfiction, I've written fiction, I've written women's fiction and romance and a lot of other genres, historical and contemporary. And the one thing I sort of never looked into was mystery. And so she said, would you try this out? And I wrote the proposal and they accepted it. And I wrote the mysteries and discovered that I really loved the puzzle of it. And the intellectual, it's particularly with cozy mysteries. It's not only the intellectual puzzle of the mystery, but there's all the community and relationships. And those are all great things from romance. So it was a pretty easy hop but even I was surprised how much I loved it and wanted to do more of it.
Can you tell us a little bit about your first mystery? Is it On Skein of Death? Am I getting that?
On Skein of Death, yes.
Skein of Death, okay.
Skein of Death is the first in the Riverbank Knitting Mysteries, and they are knitting related because I'm a very passionate knitter, and I wanted to be able to bring that to the genre. And because we thought that there are a lot of knitting characters in my romances, so we were hoping that some of the knitting lovers from my romance career would come over to Cozy Mysteries. So it centers around Libby Beckett, who is starting over in life, like many cozy amateur sleuths. And she's long put off the dream of opening her own yarn shop. And so she does. And it doesn't quite go smoothly. The first celebrity guest that she brings in for her first big event meets with an untimely end, as many people do in Cozy Mysteries. So the shop really becomes the center focus, the shop, and where, the fictional town of Collinsville, Maryland, and all of her friends and the police chief, and the same sort of cast of wonderful community that you expect from a cozy mystery. So they'll all be set in this town with this cast, and characters moving in and out as each of the books needs.
One of the things I love as a reader is when you're reading mysteries, you not only get entertaining stories, but you often learn about a subject you never knew anything about. And in this case, it's knitting. I was fascinated by a lot of different things that you put into the story. Can you talk a little bit about your passion for knitting? And one of the things that I found intriguing was that I never knew algebra played a role.
One of my favorite responses from readers has been either I didn't knit and now I want to, or you've captured what I love about knitting and haven't been able to put into words. So part of the challenge for me was to put into it the love of color, the love of texture, what it feels like to have great yarn between your fingers, what it feels like to make something, and to put that love and the idea that many knitters hold, that it connects us all. I literally was just traveling, literally earlier this week, I was knitting in the airport and on the plane, and the woman sat down next to me and she was a knitter, and instantly we were talking. So that connectivity that brings people together. And I think that the readers, if they are knitters, they see that reflected and they feel like, yes, I'm Libby. I know that feeling of wanting to have other people knit. And if they're not knitters, I think they get it. They understand the passion. But I also, some of the letters that I've gotten that I really like are, I learned a lot about knitting, but it still didn't sort of take over the book. It wasn't an epistle on why everyone should knit. It was a good murder mystery grounded in the craft of knitting. And that balance was really important for me to hit. So I'm glad that it's struck that for most of the readers.
And that algebra thing?
The algebra thing, yes, the quadratic equation. I am a words person, like many writers. I'm married to an engineer who is a numbers person. So it's always funny to me when the numbers rear their heads, and the idea that you calculate, particularly if you want to do your own pattern or if you want to alter a pattern, you need to know how many stitches per inch and things like that. So there's an actual quadratic equation that any knitter will use. And I remember saying when I learned algebra that whenever year we learn algebra, I'll never use this. And sure enough, there it was. So there are a lot of mathematical pieces to it, particularly if you're altering or designing a pattern. And I love that because in the same way that I teach project management for writers, I think people don't understand that there's a science behind the knitting. There's a reason why things work or don't work. And it's fun to show that side of it.
Now, in your book, I guess you kind of call her a celebrity knitwear designer or knitter, is murdered. Is this a real thing in the world of knitting? Are there like big names that people follow and stars in the knitting realm?
Yeah, there really are knitting rock stars. Okay. The joke term is knitterati, like literati, or
I didn't. Yeah.
There are designers who have huge followings and big events. And I think a lot of people were surprised that there was a Chicago Sun-Times interviewer who said, I didn't really believe this was a rock star. He called the local yarn shop, and the local yarn shop said, yeah, there are people with that much reach and that much celebrity. So it is kind of fun to think of that. But I will grant you, it's probably a small section of the community, but those people are really beloved by knitters.
And is there that much, I guess there is, difference between different regional or cultural kinds of patterns and things? Because you talk a lot about Danish and Norwegian, Scandinavian, where you can really tell where a pattern comes from the country.
In some cases, yes. The Selbu mittens are really probably strong example. I wanted to touch a little bit on the idea of the culture and how it is for some communities, like, Irish Aran cable knits and things like that. There are types of knitting that are deeply ingrained in cultures. And so I did want to explore how much do we get to borrow from that? How much do we get to pretend that we've got access, or just assume that we have access to that community? And so it was fun for me to dig into that, to the whole. Selbu mittens are a very particular, like if anybody would think of a ski sweater with the sort of intricate pattern of snowflakes and zigzags and things like that, most people would recognize that, but they probably wouldn't know that it's Norwegian or Danish knitting, or that it's those very intricate mittens that you see people wearing, that they're Selbu. They're a specific Norwegian cultural, and there's a whole tradition behind them. So it was fun for me, and just interesting as an artist and a writer and a curious person, to dive into that. And where are the limits? Where's the line? What's crossing the line? That was really intriguing for me. And I hope to do that with each of the Riverbank books, with some aspect of knitting, to go deep into it so that you learn a little bit. Then the one that's coming out next year is called Knit or Die Trying, DYE. And it's all about the process of yarn dyeing and artisan yarn dyeing. And the one that's coming out next Christmas, the working title is It Came Upon a Midnight Shear, because there has to be a pun, right? All good cozy mysteries have to have a pun in the title. And that one delves into the vicuña, which is this very small Peruvian animal that produces the most expensive exclusive yarn in the world. And I wanted to dig into that. Where did that come from? How hard is it to get it? What makes it so exclusive? So it's fun for me. And I think that fun and that curiosity shows up in the book, and the readers like that, and they want to come along for the ride.
I thought it was really clever, and it may have been planned, it may have been happenstance, but to set a cozy mystery in the world of knitting, there's kind of parallels. Knitters follow a pattern. An amateur sleuth has to look for a pattern in the clues. So you're both kind of borrowing off those themes. Your book has been labeled a cozy, marketed as a cozy mystery. How would you define cozy mysteries?
Cozy mysteries are the opposite of the sort of gritty, dark, thriller kind of mystery suspense novel. They're generally not too gruesome. The murder almost always happens off the page, so you're not spending a lot of time describing, dead bodies and such. And it's really about the amateur sleuth. It's almost always an amateur sleuth, someone who either stumbles into their talent for solving mysteries. But it's a lot about that person, male or female, and all of the people around them and their community that support them and help them find the clues. I did a blog post last year about why knitters make great mystery solvers, that we're used to going back to a pattern and you see patterns and you see clues. And if you drop a stitch, you see where and you have to sort of follow it down. So it's a lot of the same skills. And it was funny how much response we got to that blog post about why knitters make great mystery solvers. but they do. We're used to looking at patterns, and we're used to finding mistakes and going back methodically and undoing them to set things right. So it was a pretty easy connection to make for me and for lots of other people, I think.
Let's talk a little bit about your writing process. As you wrote your new mystery, did you find you had to change things a little bit? Because there are some differences between genres. In a mystery, you do have to think about, how do I place clues? How do I think of suspects and motives? But there's also universal things that you can cross from different fictional genres. So can you talk a little bit about your process, and did you find that you had to modify things for On Skein of Death?
I really did, because romance follows a pretty, there's a lot of diversity within the romance community. There's a pretty set, I'll say, rhythm to a romance. Boy meets girl, boy falls for girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl back. It's not quite as clear in each book, and I don't do a lot of advanced plotting. And of course, you must in a mystery, or you have to go back and redo things. So it was a retooling for me, partly because of that, and partly because of after 40 some odd romances, it's really almost intrinsic. I've got a real sort of innate organic sense of how a romance goes, and to have to set that aside and go back into the mystery where you need to build upon build upon build upon build. And when is it okay to have the sleuth discover who did it? And what will readers take in terms of how soon do they see that? Do you have to hold it off until the last minute? Libby discovers who she thinks is the killer, and then has to figure out how to prove it. And that's slightly different than the sort of grand last minute reveal. So I'm relearning that, and that's a great, as a writer, it's terrific to stretch new muscles like that after all those romances, and then to be able to bring in the relationship pieces. So there are some things that cross over. You have to know, there has to be a question that, it's a little more obvious in the mystery, the question that pulls the reader along through the story. But at the same time, you have to have that. You have to have those unanswered questions and building layer upon layer upon layer. So it's a slightly different skill set, but you still need characters that you love or hate. You still need people who feel real, and dialogue that doesn't sound stilted, and particularly in a mystery where you have to carefully drop really important pieces of information without having a character say something like, well, as you know, he was widely hated by all of his employees, or something like that. So there's still dialogue tricks to revealing information that are useful in both.
It's a real fine line to navigate. And I think probably the best example I can think of who someone excelled at it was Agatha Christie. She was often accused of writing very plainly, but that's because she was throwing things at the reader without them really picking up on them in her dialogue and her writing.
It's a tough balance to drop a clue that is going to be very important. So you need to make sure that the reader catches it, or when they see the outcome of that clue, they go, oh, that's right, whatever. So you have to kind of, I think the balance is between the reader going to being totally surprised by who did it, or having that wonderfully satisfaction, I knew it was him all along. And you want them to have either, or if you're lucky, both, where you've surprised them, but still at the same time, it's not out of the blue. They realize what it was, and then they feel really good about having followed that track of clues.
Mm-hmm. In addition to writing, you also coach and teach writing. Can you tell us a little bit about the method that you've developed and what you've learned working with writers?
Yes, I think I'm probably just as known, at least in the writer community, for the chunky method, which is the process of writing that I teach. As for my fiction writing and my nonfiction, the chunky method really came from my meeting in the fundraising community and in category romance, which is a very sort of high volume business. Category romance authors are expected to produce 4 or 5 books a year. you have to really know what you're doing in terms of productivity to make that happen. And so I used the skills that I had learned in grant writing and what I sort of knew from basic project management. It's very interesting. People who have talked about the chunky method say it's project management for writers. And being married to an engineer, he's like, exactly, that's it. And the surprise is that most people think that if you apply that sort of process of, I need to do this thing over and over and over again to get to my goal, and I need to schedule it, and I need to set expectations and benchmarks and things like that. A lot of people feel that if you apply that to art, it's just going to squash all the magic out of it. And I think exactly the opposite is true, that if you create what I call your chunk, which is almost every writer I know has this creative battery. You can get so many words out before you sort of run out of juice. You either lose your attention or your energy goes or whatever. And so once you discover what that chunk is, and it's wildly different for every author, but it's pretty consistent between authors. I work with authors whose chunk is 200 words. I work with authors whose chunk is 3,500 words. Once you know that, then you can build a schedule, and you can know certain things about yourself. For example, big chunk writers have to sit down for long periods of time. So there's certain ways that you schedule that, as opposed to someone who just needs to write 300 or 400 words every day. Once you learn that, and you learn a couple of things about your style, you can create a really well-informed schedule that isn't built on somebody else's idea of how you ought to write. And you're working off your own abilities. So it's very confidence building. It gains momentum because you're meeting all your benchmarks because they're built on how you already write. And so it's very empowering for writers. And I love to teach it because you see light bulbs go off over their head, like, oh, that's why I do what I do, or that's why that's so hard. And once you get that, so that's a real energizer for me. I love to do it. Speaking and teaching feeds the extrovert in me. It's a dangerous thing to have a wildly introverted writer. You lock me alone in my office with my imaginary friends all day, and I get a little squirrely. So it's very satisfying for me to not only be the person to sort of unlock that for them, but to get to go around and do that. I do a lot of speaking at conferences, keynoting at conferences, and to be able to just tell people you can be systematic about this, and it's not going to squash all the art out of it. In fact, I genuinely believe it makes the art more possible. So you get me on the soapbox about the chunky method, and I can go on for hours, but I love that part of my career as well.
What advice would you give to someone who's just starting out as a writer?
I would give them the advice that I got, which is maybe a little bit counterintuitive, which was quite simply, hush up and write. In that there's no substitute for writing. You don't learn any better than you learn by actually writing. You can read all the craft books you want. You can make all the plans you want. You can do all the studying you want. And nothing's going to forward your career like sitting down and doing what a friend calls the BICHOK School of Writing, BICHOK, which stands for butt in chair and hands on keyboard. There's no other. So just do it. You learn. You can't fix what's already not written. You can't fix a blank page. Start the writing. I genuinely believe in powering your way through that first draft, even if you feel like you don't know what you're doing, which still, after as many books that I've written, there are books that are just, I don't know what I'm doing, but I know to power through and get all the way through that first draft, because when you get to the end of that story the first time, then you can go back and edit with a lot more intelligence, knowing where you want it to end up. So that's really the advice that I always give. Just hush up, stop second guessing yourself, stop thinking about all of those tactics and whatever in the last conference that you went to, and just get the words down on paper.
Now, based on the number of years you have in the business writing, as you think back, what do you know now as a writer that you wish you had known when you were first starting out about publishing?
Oh, Wow, that's a great question. I think one of the things would be I always believed there was a point where I would feel established, like I made it or I got it, and it would feel slightly easier. And there wouldn't be that moment where there still is in every single book where I hate it. I think it's the worst thing I've ever written. I'm sure the editors are going to go, oh, well, she's used up her tube of toothpaste. Like creativity is some sort of toothpaste tube that you get to the end of. That there is no point. I mean, I've talked to really successful authors who still don't feel like they're established. So the big surprise for me that I wish I'd known was I kept waiting for that moment to happen. And that moment isn't coming. We're always just taking the next logical step and moving things up to the next level. But there's no moment where I felt established or as though it was all working perfectly. And that you can have just as fine a career, what I call a slow climb in the same direction, as opposed to this lightning round, this lightning leap to the top that you see some writers taking. I don't think that I wish that I had known that that's not necessarily the only way. I've really had a long, slow, steady career as opposed to any great massive success with any one book. And I wish that I'd known that that was going to be just fine.
I think there's a lot of wisdom to what you're saying. It's kind of the tortoise and the hare approach to writing, because writers who have that kind of instantaneous burst of selling and sales and success, there's a lot of pressure that they have to match that now with their next book. And if they don't, a lot of their careers are ended.
Yeah. I did sell the first book I ever wrote. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people ask, how did you, wasn't that wonderful? And sometimes I think, not so much. I think I wished I'd had maybe one or two full manuscripts underneath me before I was thrust into, a major, I sold my first book to a major New York publishing house. And while that was great, and it was kind of fun to tell that sort of Cinderella story, there were things that I wished I'd sort of had under my belt before being thrown into that very high pressure situation.
Let's talk a little bit about the business side of writing. What kind of impact has social media had on you as a writer? Do you have particular platforms that you prefer to use? How do you connect with readers socially?
Social media has more impact than I'd like. It requires a lot of time and energy that I think most writers wish we could spend writing. That's the sort of downside of it. And it is sort of a constant feeding beast. I do have an assistant who helps me with some of it because it's just so time consuming. And I think the other thing that's a big struggle for me is there's always the next new platform, right? I can't bring myself to get on TikTok. Everyone's saying you need to be on TikTok. And I'm like, I just can't do another one. So that piece of it is difficult. At the same time, I love being able to share moments with readers, share inspiration with readers. One of the things that I love to do that I'm literally doing right now, I'm traveling at the moment, is I'll drop into bookstores and sign the book and take a photograph and put that out on social media and say, hey, there's a signed copy here for you at this, whatever store. That's fun. And that's something that we never could have done before. And it's fun to get firsthand feedback from people, for someone, just sending you a Facebook message saying, wow, I really love this one, and this and this and this. So it's pleasant, and it's a great way to meet readers, but it seems to be this sort of insatiable beast that you have to keep feeding. And that's tough. It's tough to find the energy and the attention and still feel like you're making your books your primary place where everything needs to be, your energy and your focus. It's hard to balance that. So it's plus or minus. It's one of those, it has its great points and it has its not so great points. I have not had the experience of anybody saying horrible things about me on Facebook or Twitter, knock, knock. So we'll see.
Do you read your reviews
It's a
on
blessing.
social media?
Pardon me?
Do you read your reviews on social media? I know some authors don't like to look at what readers are saying.
You know, there's another place where the theater background has been very useful in that I can read reviews and let the bad ones sort of wash off me from, you know, I'm 6 feet tall. And so when I would go to auditions, many times I would give a great performance and I would lose the role because I was too tall. Cannot change that, right? I can't suddenly become shorter. So to be able to look at that in the same lens, that I'm just not the book that they liked. I mean, occasionally people will get sort of personal. It's only happened once or twice, and then you just sort of try to let it go. But no, I do read the reviews. I follow my father's advice, which was when the third person tells you you're drunk, lie down. So if someone knocks a book, if one person knocks a book for a particular reason, I tend to sort of slough it off. If 5 people knock a book for a particular reason, I pay attention to that, saying, what fed that? How can I change it for the next book? So I do try to learn from it. And I do keep the ones that are really lovely because I need that fuel. I need to be able to go back and read those lovely things when I'm having a bad day, and I save them. I save the praise and I save the wonderful fun ones, because I think you need to celebrate the happy stuff. This is an uphill climb for the best of us, and so we need to celebrate every moment that we can.
Let's switch gears and talk a little bit about you as a reader. You've written romance and now mystery and historical romance. What kind of a reader are you? And is there anything you've read this year that you'd like to share with other readers?
I read very widely. I don't read just romance or mystery. And as a matter of fact, because of my theater background, I have a really strong ear for mimicry, part of an acting training. So I have to actually be careful what I'm reading. It should never be in the same genre that I'm writing. So I read very widely. Some of the favorite things that I've read right now, I'm reading The Guest List, which is a mystery, but it's a different kind of mystery than I write.
Definitely not cozy.
No, not cozy, and a sort of a long, slow suspense burn with a lot of different, points of view. I'm really enjoying that. One of the books that I've loved everything Aaron Mortensen has done. I loved The Night Circus. I devoured The Starless Sea, which is completely different than anything I write. It's very, magical realism and all kinds of wonderful characters. I've been a raging Diana Gabaldon fan from the beginning. I'm eagerly awaiting her next
Tuesday.
one.
Yeah.
Yes. And because she, again, it's nice to be able to pick out, her characters are so real, they have so much depth. They interact in ways that ring so true. And she, her research is wonderful, but not overwhelming. So all of those kinds of things. And I read, I just finished Atomic Habits, which is a nonfiction book, which I love. Any of those productivity things, I just devour. So I read a lot of widely. I'm also a big audiobook fan, for a couple of different reasons. And then the one way I can get away with reading in the same genre that I'm writing, because I'm always writing in some genre, is to do an audiobook, because then it seems to, I can just absorb it without wanting to mimic it. But if I need to pick up a dialect or a historical manner of speaking, an audiobook is a great place to do that. If I was writing, I wrote a character with who was an Australian, he was an Aussie. So I picked up a couple of books that were set in Australia so I could get that rhythm in my ear, and his dialogue would sound true to that. If I'm writing in a Southern location, I'll pick up a Southern book. I picked up The Mermaid Chair for just that reason. I was writing in that region. I wanted that rhythm, that musicality in my ear. So wide variety.
Now you mentioned there's going to be some more books in the Riverside Knitting series. Can you tell us a little bit about what's coming next from you as an author, both mystery and not?
I have a lot of books coming out next year. It just so happens that they all fell there. I think it's 6 total, so it's a lot. The next thing that will be out for me is a Love Inspired. So the other half of my career is with Love Inspired, which is the faith-based arm of Harlequin Romance. So I'll be finishing up a series that was called the Wander Canyon series. The last book in the Wander Canyon series will be out in March from Love Inspired, and then in April will be the next Riverbank, and that is Knit or Die Trying. So that's the second book in the series. And then in July, I have another that starts a brand new series that's set in the Phoenix area, which is how we met. That's set in a town that's loosely based on Prescott, Arizona. Okay. And that'll be starting in June. And then there'll be the third of the Riverbank knitting series in sometime. It's a holiday book, so I'm assuming it's going to be November, December. You know, supply chain issues being what they are, things are very fluid in that department. So It Came Upon a Midnight Shear will be sometime for the holidays. I'm assuming October or November, and there'll be somewhere in there will be the second. The Arizona series is called True North Springs. Yeah. And then I'm also working with a small press to do a little novella with a bunch of debut authors, which is kind of fun. So that's a lot of books to have come out in 1 year. There's a great big schedule on my office wall, and that's why I need to keep track of all of that.
You do. Was that because of the way pandemic affected publishing and schedules got disrupted and books got pushed forward and back? And
yes, things got pushed back a little bit. Some books that were supposed to come out late this year weren't able to because they couldn't even get the paper to the printer, kinds of things. Yeah. So it is a little bit of a kind of a squash together from COVID. But I'm also really, really looking forward to 2022 being the year that I can get back out with readers, back out into events. I love that, and I miss it so much.
And so if readers want to know more about you, learn more about you or your books, they can go to your website. Is that correct?
Yes, the best place to start, because I do so many different things, is to start at alliepleiter.com. And that will take you to either the coaching or the nonfiction writing books or the fiction books, the romances, the mysteries. There's a lot. So it's the best place to start. If we do it right, it lets you find where you want to be pretty quickly.
I can't believe how fast our time has flown by. It's just been delightful chatting with you, Allie. Is there anything else you'd like to share with readers before we have to sign off?
I'd love for them to get to meet Libby. I'd love to let the Riverbank Knitting Mysteries find a whole bunch of new readers before we have the second one come out. It's great fun. There's a knitting pattern in the back of the book. There's a lot to enjoy if you're a knitter or a non-knitter. And I love that people have been buying it and reading it and then passing it along to a friend and buying another copy for a friend. As an author, boy, that's the best thing ever.
And I can definitely attest, I have no interest in knitting, and I found it a fascinating book.
Well, that's great. That's high praise in my book. As far as I'm concerned, that means I've done it right as far as I'm concerned.
I'd like to thank Allie Pleiter for joining us today, and for all of you tuning in to another virtual author chat at the Poison Pen Bookstore. Stop by again, either in person at the store or virtually, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.
It's been lovely and wonderful visit. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Allie. Okay, that was great. Thank you, Allie. You were just terrific.
Oh, it's great fun. Really, I miss all of the in-person stuff so much. I can't wait until we can get back to doing this, because this is fun for me.
I'll definitely let you know. Barbara is in control of the event schedule. So once we hear about next year, what's shaping up, and you're more than welcome to come back virtually anytime that you like. You're just a fascinating subject for an interview. You're really lively and entertaining. You hit all the right notes for listeners and readers.
It's one of those places where that theater training comes in pretty handy. It's good to be an extrovert. You're kind of a circus freak in the writer world, I say, to be a raging expert. But it's a good kind of circus freak to be.
That's true. Now, in case I lose you, because I'm terrible with technology when I click buttons, but thanks again for taking time to do this. And I hope you have just a wonderful Thanksgiving. And I look forward to possibly doing something next year.
Same to you. It was great fun to meet you on our trip, and there's quite a few more books in the True North series, so I suspect I'll be out to Phoenix a couple of times, and it was lovely to get to know the legendary you, because everybody said, oh, you're getting to see him and getting to meet him, and a lot of author friends were just tickled pink and really jealous.
Well, that's nice of you to say. Thank you again, and I hope you have a wonderful holiday season.
Same to you and yours.